Well, thank you all for joining us for our virtual program, listening to the experiences of people of color in business. Very important discussion. We'll get started here in just a minute or two. In the meantime, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat function so we know who's here and we can introduce ourselves to one another virtually, and we'll start the program here in just a moment or two. Well, again, good morning. My name is Steve Kramer. I'm the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Downtown Council, and thank you very much for joining us for this virtual program, listening to the experiences of people of color in business. Always, I think in these times, it's appropriate to start with a wishing everyone well from a health standpoint, both yourself, your family, all of your colleagues. It's kind of an extraordinary time, both from a COVID-19 standpoint and, of course, all of the tragedy that occurred in our community on Memorial Day and things that have unfolded since then. I know in our own way, we're all working to overcome that and to recognize what we have to do as a community together to get better for all of our community members. And that really leads us very much to the topic today. On the COVID front, which is still very much with us, as we all know, I do want you to know that the Downtown Council is collecting information as it comes out, and you can, if you're interested and would find it helpful, you can access all of those resources at our website, mplsdowntown.com/COVID-19. So please access that information or pass it on to your colleagues and clients if you would find it useful. I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Mary Beth Weisberg, who's our Director of Membership and Partnership. And Mary Beth is going to run through a few housekeeping items. Then I'll make announcements about a couple of upcoming programs and then today's program. So Mary Beth, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. So before we get started, just wanted to let you know, like Steve said, about a few housekeeping items to remember as we go through the webinar. So we're all at the mercy of our Wi-Fi connections and technology, and we thank you for your patience should we experience any technical challenges. We did want to let you know that this conversation is being recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out a link, and you should feel free to share that with others. As we kick off the program, as Steve said, feel free to introduce yourself with your name and company in the chat. And if you have questions that you would like answered by the panelists at the end of the presentation, just use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the program. Now I'm going to hand it back to Steve, who's going to share that information about some upcoming programs.
Thanks, Mary Beth. I love your background. The only frustrating thing is that, if COVID doesn't get behind us, we're just not going to be able to have that parade for the Twins when they win the World Series this year. But
absolutely,
cross that bridge when we come to it, right?
Right.
So we do have a couple of upcoming programs that I want to mention. On August 13th, we'll have a similar virtual program that will focus on how businesses are including socially responsible and environmentally friendly policies in their work. And then on August 20th, very interesting topic, I think very relevant for many of us, talk about how downtown schools in the downtown area are preparing for the 2021 school year. And of course, we'll hear from Governor Walz probably tomorrow about the statewide approach on that issue. And continue to look for more information at mplsdowntown.com for further details about those programs and other registration opportunities and other things that we'll be doing through the course of the year. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to our colleague, Mary Beth, and my colleague, Dan Collison, who is our Director of Downtown Partnerships, and he's going to take it from here. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Dan?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Downtown Council team and staff, and thank you for everyone who's either tuned in now or watching this later as it's broadcast to the world. It is a privilege to be here today, and just for background, the Minneapolis Downtown Council a year ago came out and produced a report to the community on a year-long process called the Inclusive Downtown Think Tank that was done with our partner at the Greater Twin Cities YMCA Equity Innovation Center. And that study and that report has laid the groundwork for several channels of work for us to become a more inclusive downtown, but more specifically, get into all the layers of what it means to be a downtown where leaders of color and businesses that are owned by leaders of color are prominent and are shaping the broader culture as we see it. This conversation today is a part of a series that we're looking to do throughout the coming year, both in light of the killing of George Floyd, which has exposed some really, really, really difficult and challenging rifts, both that have been there but are renewed. And also this larger and longer conversation about how the marketplace can play an important role in transforming these conversations and closing gaps. I'll just mention before I have the pleasure to introduce these esteemed leaders today who are incredible shapers of culture and business and commerce, and they are the stars of today. But I do want you to know the gaps specifically that the Inclusive Downtown Think Tank named are empathy for one another, social capital, places for youth and families, barriers to hiring, cultural competence amongst leaders, and disparities between gender and persons of color in the business leadership and ownership overall. That was a year of learning, and that was a piece of it. And the work of the Inclusive Downtown Action Group, which is what we pivoted to after the think tank, is to work through and across 3 different channels. One of those channels is to be looking at inclusive economic growth, and we have the Chameleon Consortium working on systems change to bring diverse businesses into downtown retail to begin with, and then go from there. I should say more diverse businesses. There's some incredibly diverse owned businesses already here. And then also to develop culturally competent leaders. And then finally, thrive, participate, and belong. And we're beginning to look at this from a talent, bridging, recruiting, and retaining aspect, and there's more on that coming later. But for today, as we get going in this conversation, and I'm so pleased to introduce the stars to you, we want to have a special look at some of the historic aspects of how the American United States and Minnesota landscape of business has engaged with businesses of color and leaders of color. And there's no better way to do that than to have people share their story. So what we're going to do in this first kind of lightning round is have our special guests give a background of their business and their work and their leadership role within it. And so the people we have today are Siad Abdullahi, who's the president and CEO of Language Banc, Alfredo Martel, the president and CEO of the Metropolitan Economic Development Association, or MEDA, and then Kenya McKnight, who's the president and CEO of Black Women's Wealth Alliance. And I have the pleasure of both knowing these colleagues in the broader business world, and I've gotten to know them personally as well through various conversations. And so why don't we start with Siad? Just very quickly, briefly describe the work of your organization and your leadership role within it.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I want to thank you for the opportunity to engage in this, and I want to thank Steve Kramer and Mary Beth and the team at Downtown Council. I am on the board. Maybe that's my first best way to introduce myself, is I'm on the board at the Downtown Council. I'm an entrepreneur in the healthcare space. I'm an immigrant, but I feel like I've been in the US for 20 years now. So at least I came here from the East Coast. I did graduate school in the Boston area, and then subsequently moved to Minnesota. I run Pro Healthcare, Language Banc, and Transit Trip, which are 3 companies that do business in the healthcare space. We do work for a lot of the health plans, the Medicaid health plans, Blue Cross, Medicare, United Health, Optum, UCare. We take care of patients and clients who have either linguistic or cross-cultural limitations in communications. We support the hospital teams, case management, home healthcare, non-emergency medical transportation, and translation service. We run a call center that does business in over 150 languages. We employed, pre-COVID, almost 1,000 people as independent contractors and almost about 350 as FTE employees in our business ecosystem. I'm excited to be here, and I'm happy to engage with our audience.
Thank you so much, Siad. Alfredo, title, organization, and your work within it.
Well, first of all, welcome and thank you to the Minneapolis Downtown Council for the opportunity to share our story. My name is Alfredo Martel, born in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I am bilingual, so English is my second language, so I apologize already for any metaphors that I might have to use to get my points across. I am the president and CEO of MEDA. We are an integrated services BIPOC business development organization. We're a nonprofit. We provide business consultancy. We provide lending. We are a CDFI, or a community development financial institution. And we also are a market maker. We match minority businesses with corporations or large employers and establish sustainable long-term partnerships. My story is one, I love Siad's story. We might have been in Boston at some point together because I did my graduate work there at Boston College. My story in terms of a Latino business leader is one of having been born in Puerto Rico, of Cuban exilee family. My family left Cuba in '59. And that's, some of you might know that that's referred as the golden exile, although no such thing. But cultural differences within one ethnic or let's call it a racial group or denomination, something that's really interesting in my journey, because not all Latinos are the same, and Mexican heritage, Cuban heritage, Puerto Rican heritage are very different, but they're often intertwined and considered one. And so that's an interesting part of my journey in terms of how I've experienced my ethnicity and my culture through business.
Excellent, thank you. And there'll be more on that in our next sort of round of conversation. Kenya McKnight, your role, your organization, and the specifics of what you do within that. I don't think we have Kenya's audio. Still can't hear Kenya's audio. I know sometimes when it comes to the myriad of platforms that we have, we need to actually phone in addition to our video in. And so I don't know, Kenya, if that's, and the team,
Okay.
if that's one solution we can do.
Sure. You still can't hear me?
Hey!
Oh, you can. All right, great. Yay. Wow, the technical difficulties today. Kenya McKnight, president and founder of the Black Women's Wealth Alliance. We're located in North Minneapolis. So what we do is provide wealth building, cultural wealth building, education services to what we identify as historical Black women who've been in this country for hundreds of years, which I am also a historical Black woman. Native of Illinois. I've lived in Minnesota, Minneapolis, specifically for the last 38 years of my life. I'm 25, but you know, last 38 years of my life. And we serve a base of entrepreneurs, Black women entrepreneurs, as well as workers, and provide them with, again, cultural wealth building, education, skill building, some granting, right, small capacity grants, and, you know, just some professional development services. In addition, we work with public and private agencies to provide cultural and other financial services as well. So that's what we do. Is that what you want me to?
That's perfect. No, that's great. And we're going to keep going. This is going to be like a layering with the next round going even deeper. In fact, let's move right into that with Siad. So I'm always fascinated with how personal narrative interacts with meta narrative, or I should say meta narratives, because I feel like it gives people of all backgrounds more of a human side of this, but we don't sort of get erased from the larger historical narratives that have been very problematic in our society and in Minnesota. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're having these conversations. So Siad, starting with you, what's your personal story of being a Somali American and business leader? And please feel free to elucidate a little bit of the larger historical layers to this. And as you always do, and I know all of you will do today, just feel free to sort of dance between the personal and the larger narrative.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. You have to be careful and give me a time
Okay, 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
When you tell an immigrant to tell a story, you know, it could take hours. But anyway, on a much serious note, I'll try to keep this within 5 minutes. As was said, you know, I'm an entrepreneur, and about, I would say 60–70% of the challenges I face are pretty universal to just about every entrepreneur, right? Trying to do a lot with less and trying to grow your business. But there are a few things that are challenging specific to a person of color, and particularly to an African individual, and I think particularly to an African immigrant. Now, my personal story, I was born in Kenya, so I have to add that there's a third layer of an, you know, I'm a Kenyan American who's an ethnic Somali. So yes, you know, I'm an ethnic Somali, but I have a little bit of a personal historical difference in the sense that I grew up in a country, which is Kenya, which has historically been more stable, which is has an English-British colonial system that had tremendous amounts of access to great education. So I have to just nuance that a bit. And so I came here as a graduate student in the Boston area, and then subsequently moved to Minnesota to take a job at Hennepin County Community Health, and then MDH, and did some consulting work for Blue Cross, and subsequently started a business out of a cubicle in St. Louis Park that has now grown to, you know, hundreds of employees and thousands of independent contractors. And now that's really, you know, I have a family here. I have kids who are born in Minnesota, who go to Minnesota schools. So that really it captures the essence of most immigrants in Minnesota. Now there are, of course, challenges in that great story, which you know, generally is, I can sum them up. You know, I talk about something that I think Dan would appreciate, which is this maturity compendium or maturity scale. I'm going to try to take this to, you know, to a 360 level, because it's easy for everyone to talk about access to credit, banking issues. I think these are things that are generally known by everybody, right? We don't come from communities in which people have, you know, tremendous credit or tremendous stock market resources, or parents who can underwrite loans for you, you know. But those are things that are known by everybody. I want to spend two minutes about things that generally may not be universally known. And I want to talk about this issue of maturity for minority businesses. What do I mean by that? If you look at the industries in which we engage in Minnesota, they are predominantly things like cab service, restaurants, food service businesses, folks driving Uber, even at a company level, ethnic restaurants. There is a challenge in breaking the ceiling into becoming a mainstream business. And I want us as business leaders to challenge ourselves. How can we elevate African American, African immigrant, Hispanic, Native American businesses to count among those businesses that have gone on a maturity scale, for them to be seen as credible vendors at 50 million, 100 million level? This, I think, is where everybody gets to 3 to 5 million, gets a small contract, get a restaurant, and then that's just about where you plateau. And this is the challenge I have for Minnesota's business community, is how can we, and I think it speaks to the issue of confidence on both sides. And what do I mean by that? I feel like sometimes there's a subconscious bias that we think that business isn't capable, right? And so you don't take a leap of faith, because if you are running a company like Target or United Health, you don't want to have a vendor that fails you at time of need. So you tend to have this subconscious bias that you're thinking, these guys are good for running that Hispanic restaurants, but maybe I can't trust them with this $100 million contract that has a federal component, because they may not be able to deliver. So that, I think, is what I would sum up by saying, there are stories like mine that have gotten companies to 7 million in gross revenue, 20 million in gross revenue. This is generally where most small businesses, if you get to your 5th anniversary, you are likely to make it. But then where is the next level? Where is going to be that corporate relationship? There is empathy. I agree with Dan, we have empathy. I think we don't have relationships. The empathy has not grown to relationships. There's empathy where you have empathy for something being burnt on Lake Street. And we can all go to GoFundMe and donate $250. Can we translate that to a higher level and say a company like Target or United Health or 3M or General Mills or Cargill would go out there and actually look at immigrant businesses or African-American owned businesses or Hispanic owned businesses and say, we'll take a cohort of companies that are around 5 million or 10 million, and we are going to intentionally grow them and have them grow with us so we can have the next level of mature business leaders in our community that can trickle effect those dollars back into their communities. That's where I would stop, Dan, and I'm happy to engage later on. But Alfredo, you're right. We might have been in Boston around the same time. So I'll check with you and chat with you on later.
No, I appreciate that, Ziad. And for Alfredo and Kenya, it's 5-ish minutes.
Yes.
And this is just a great chance to do even what Ziad did and sort of lay out some of your main points of challenge that you would like to see a larger array of leaders be engaged with. So thank you. And we will just keep sort of recircling around these. Well, Alfredo, bring us into that dance, the personal and the meta narrative.
Well, thank you. And Ziad, your comments on maturity. In fact, Twin City Ascend, which is a MEDA program, is all about taking these businesses to the next level. So access to those networks, access to ensuring that those contract specs are met consistently, clearly is a trust factor and a capability building opportunity. My personal narrative, I would just say, being born in Puerto Rico from Cuban parents who were immigrants into Puerto Rico, they were fleeing, of course, communist regime from Fidel Castro. And so I was born with Cuban heritage and culture, but also living in Puerto Rican heritage, culture, and traditions. So at a very early age, I was already combining different backgrounds. And I call myself and my kids, my family, kind of like, the United Colors of Benetton, because we've been cobbling together ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. One of the interesting things that I would note is, as I mentioned, Hispanic as a block is not monolithic. That's a very important thing that I would love to share in my personal journey. When I say my name is Alfredo Martel, yo hablo español, immediately I am assumed that I must be Mexican, and or when I was in Puerto Rico, I was referred to as Cuban. So my identity varies and flexes depending on who I'm talking, even though in America, we have this sort of Latino block, right? And I'm sure that Ziad can relate to that. It's like Africa's a big continent, right? Full of different people. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I find has been really an interesting challenge in my journey. The other one I would say, to piggyback on Ziad's commentary, is about ethnic groups, Latino groups, BIPOC groups, individuals, and information. I find it very interesting that a Latino, and I'll speak on my behalf, a Latino can be in a room and be surrounded by mainstream white individuals and receive a very different network treatment and a very different set of information packages in the same room. So access is not just the solution. Walking into a room and talking about my family, my friends, how are the kids, how's the festival in San Juan, and boy, I love the beaches in Puerto Rico, see you later, is very different from than a mainstream or a white person walking in the same exact room, talking to the exact same people and hearing, hey, did you hear about the merger and acquisition project that's going on so and so and so and so? So access to those information packets and networks, I think, is something that Ziad was sort of talking about. And it's very interesting because I think it might stem from that assumption that the fun-loving Hispanic Puerto Rican guy just wants to talk social and is not necessarily keenly interested in networking and business intelligence or business discussions. So those are some of those small points that I think add to Ziad's narrative about how conscious or unconscious biases have played into how I've had to navigate my career, how I have to navigate client relationships, coworker relationships, sort of distilling or deconstructing those biases about what a Hispanic business person or a Latino leader is interested in or capable of. Those are some of those things that I would double click from some CIAD's experience in my personal experience. I remember early in my career when I moved to the mainland, I was assigned to the, multicultural marketing sector, right? It's like, oh, you're Latino, so let's put you on multiculti, right? And nobody does that anymore because now it's all one big branding element. It's not, there's a Latino brand and there's an African-American brand and there's an Asian brand. We've dispelled that in branding. But I remember those days where I was only allowed to play in one little corner of the branding world because of my background.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think this is where maybe globalism and a global market has begun to challenge some of these assumptions and homogenous pathways that we have. I just recognize that what brings us to those rooms where we're not actually engaging about the things that matter to all of us, but maybe trivializing, is our experiences, whether it's our education or our religion or our family of origin. That if there was or there was not any sense of like, how do we develop trust and identity and understanding to a more global mindset, then we just come at it with more of a fear-based and begin to sort of put people in niches and actually miss huge opportunities to be a better person, to be a better leader, to be a better company that's changing and engaging more in different people. So thank you for that. Well, Kenya, I find your leadership so incisive, and particularly in this conversation about the traditional African-American narrative, which is the most historic within the United States, sadly dating back to 1619, prior to when we were a United States per se, and when those of African-American descent came here not of their choosing. And yet, as we now move into the 21st century, there's some evolution. There's a lot more work to be done. And what I find so compelling, you're just this incredible thinker, leader, businesswoman who brings a lot of challenges, but incredible acumen to the landscape of how we can do this together. So bring us into your world and do that dance as well. And I just want to acknowledge you've got a big lift here. But here you go.
Big lift. And actually our existence in this country dates back to what is documented in your records, but that's a different conversation. All of us didn't come here by the boat. Most of us were already here. So we should dig into that history and go beyond what we've been told, for one. So in that space, though, I'll say that my struggle is of my ancestors. It is not different. What is different about it is how it looks. So we're still struggling through a world of anti-Blackness that actually expands across all cultures, right? So it's the same. And this historical, systemic, racial constructs that we've struggled through that we call white body supremacy today. So, I'm really no different than, Ella Baker, than Ida B. Wells and, all these incredible Black women and men, who've stood in the ranks and have worked through hundreds of years. This isn't, 30, we're talking about hundreds of years of what I would call economic oppression that my people have faced and continue to face in this country. So we're continuing to rise through that, but it's difficult. When you look at the impact and the breakdown, which we call today financial trauma, that we're still struggling through, that is not acknowledged and, is something that, quite frankly, white people are happy to pass by. Because it allows them not to deal with the historical, realities of what has happened and continues to happen, which George Floyd's murder is just one of many. There's several murders that took place after his by police officers of Black people in this country. And so it continues, right? And my work, happens through generations. So as in the business context, an economic frame of what that means for historical Black people is, you know, you can go back to even, you know, in the Atlantic trade slate and look at the economic factors of that, right? We can look at how inhumane it was and still is, but we can also look at how it was about money, right, as well, right? How that our bodies were used, right, in that way, you know, to build white wealth that we're dealing with today. You know, we had a dollar sign on us, and so there was a greater value for us hurting ourselves than white people hurting us, and we see that in the prison system today. While, you know, a black person kill a black person, they go to prison for 30 years, and a white person kill us and get off for 5. So, you know, we're property in that way, according to the way this country operates with my community. And so in that, we can talk about, you know, Black Wall Street, which is popular. We can also talk about the Jim Crow laws that greatly restricted Black people's ability to do business across all communities, that any community that wasn't Black. So I can give you a number of things, even the role of Ida B. Wells in helping to bring to really highlight that the lynchings were tied to Black male entrepreneurs. And it was about the white males being, you know, fearful of losing customers. And so they would lynch the Black men who were entrepreneurs. It wasn't just about being Black, it was because they were entrepreneurs. And so you got this history that continues to go on and on. We can talk about redlining. We can talk about, oh my gosh, I can, you know, it'd take me years to talk about all the things that we've endured that has everything to do with economics and Black people and white people's need to control us in that way and to be on top of us, and to make sure that we are consumers, to make sure that we are not owners and that we do not progress in that way. And how it shows up today is that even in Minnesota, we have the lowest percentage of asset ownership. Half of the Black businesses in Minnesota are gone now via COVID. Half of the Black workers have lost their jobs now via COVID and everything else. First fired, last hired, right? And so I can't really tell you anything new, unfortunately, that, you know, I struggle with as a Black female entrepreneur, Black woman entrepreneur, other than the fact that, you know, there is also a disdain for even the work I do. I'm constantly asked to focus on women of color. I'm a historical Black woman. I'm interested in, you know, my community progressing. And somehow that is perceived as other folks not being important. So the fact that Black people, the culture that I come from, struggle to, you know, have a space where we are okay, where we're caring about ourselves and building on ourselves is seen as anti everybody else, is a problem in itself. I think scaling businesses, well, you know, we've led businesses the whole time, all across this country, and we have businesses across the spectrum. You know, that isn't our issue. I think part of the issue is so aspiration and coming up with business ideas. I mean, you know as well as I know, we built the infrastructure of this country. So we are the business leaders here, but we don't get that frame. We're told that somehow what powers this country is immigrants, you know, or indigenous folks. And so there's no way, like, where are we in this space? You know, how do you acknowledge our contributions and the fact that we own a lot of infrastructure that we built that wasn't given to us? We don't have any reparations or restoration. What we have is what we've created for ourselves. And so for me, I think the real question is not really what our struggles are. I think the question is, what is the next level, right? How do we build a shared economy where we are central in that, where you have value for what our cultural markets are, where white folks are happy to, you know, purchase things that are not American. But are you interested in the African-American, you know, economy and cultural markets and what that means to us, how you power that? And so I think we're seeing big corporations take different steps with Target, Google, PayPal, who are all really acknowledging that space of what that means for historical Black people that might be different for other folks. And we need that acknowledgement. We need that support. Everybody needs what they need, but we also need what we need. So I know that doesn't answer your question as directly, but this is what I can provide you from a historical frame of the kind of economic oppression and trauma we have faced and continue to struggle through every area of our life. And then in the entrepreneurial space It is simply the same: access to capital, acknowledgement and support for our cultural markets, right? Social capital, as you know, is one of my big things, building those relationships and pathways, and capacity building, right? Folks need help building capacity and knowledge skills in these industries to be successful as well. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I also want to make a note that your full name is Kenya McKnight Ahad. And
Yes.
I apologize for not having that in the introduction. And Kenya, thank you. I know you just actually sort of opened several valves that I think are all critically important and yet hard, particularly for some folks who maybe haven't thought along these levels, or maybe only saw things at a distance and have not been able to or invited or challenged to be self-reflective. And I guess just to all the panelists now, and we can sort of just go popcorn now for a little while here and maybe take some questions. The thing that I'm drawn to here is that there's these sort of structures that we all come to 2020 with. And there's this cultural fidelity that you have, Kenya, to the African American narrative, and Alfredo the Cuban American narrative, and Siad to the Somali American. But there's so many nuances to it, and how we're connected to the various identities. How can you just help this broader group that's here and listening today, which is trying to grapple with what's our history? And there's huge missteps that have been happened that are long before we were born, and that are going to take longer than after we're dead to continue to resolve and to repair and to help us to more flourish. And I just will do this sort of popcorn and speak to maybe your specific cultural lens, or if you've got some other thoughts for others, but let's just open this up. I feel like you've all created a really interesting landscape here, but through the lens of how do we then build a different shared set of principles and practices to do more business together. And it's open to all three of you at this point.
Well, I'll just jump in real quick because my two fellow panelists have me really excited with their comments. And I totally agree that with the statement of how do we transition from a mindset of Latino, African-American, BIPOC person as a consumer versus an owner. In our world at MEDA, business entrepreneurship is our mission. And our theory of change is all around wealth creations through business ownership. So the historical obstacles for that are the things that we work to eradicate: technical assistance, access to capital, markets. Kenya's commentary like hit home with me in terms of what we at MEDA do for a living. Now, I think that from my personal lens, connecting these two things, I've experienced in large corporations, global restaurant companies that I worked for, you can look up my resume, you know where I'm talking about, where folks were extolling the virtues of Hispanics. Oh, our Latinos are fantastic. This is when I was working in Multiculti. And at the end of the extolation of all the virtues, I realized that they were talking about employees. They work so hard. They're so loyal. They go extra for everything. And I'm sitting there trying to build a marketing campaign for Latino consumers. And the mental block was so difficult for me to face that there was no acknowledgement that what we were trying to do is to have Latino families be part of the economic ecosystem, not just the employment. I know that Kenya said, you know, we had a dollar sign on us. That was a moment for me that resonated with her statement, because it was this thing where I had a room full of business owners that say like, well, I only think of Latinos as employees. I don't think of them as market to them. And as we've seen now, as our economy has shifted and our demographics continue to shift through the years, more and more and more of this mindset needs to become history. So I would say that the participation and the access to being in the ownership economy is critical.
Thank you, Alfredo. And feel free, Kenya, to keep, you don't have to like just go around in turns. Like this is just wide open right now. And if you want to backfill any of the channels you opened up, please do.
So Dan, if you don't mind, I want to reiterate some of the things that Kenya McKnight had said. One of the things that concerns me sometimes is we had a big aha moment in a very sad 8-minute video of an individual's life being taken in a very gruesome, inhumane manner. But every decade or so, we have a moment that makes our communities explode and then implode and have very difficult conversations. So some of us, God uses us during our life when we're living and breathing, and some are used at their time of passing or sadly, through a process of death. And George Floyd, has the sad death of this man, a father. And sometimes I want to remind people that this was not an incident. Everyone has a hashtag George Floyd. I want us to be careful and remind all ourselves that these conversations we're having started out of the sad death of someone's father, and in a situation involving law enforcement. So I want to just put that out there. Secondly, I want to also reiterate what Kenya McKnight said, which is there are stories like mine can't be possible without the contributions and sacrifice of others who have come before us, African Americans and Native Americans in particular. People who were found here by Anglo-Saxons or from Europe, whose lands have been taken, and persons who were brought here as commodity and used to toil the soil and build this country for hundreds of years. So it would be lost on me if I don't acknowledge that just publicly and put that out there, that as much as we like to talk about challenges, the two challenges are just not close or the same. That those two communities in particular have very American-centric, de-stocking, dehumanizing situations in which it was not just equity wasn't given, it was equity taken away, which is radically different. So not to make this any more uncomfortable, but I just want to put that out there, that we have to appreciate that there's a historical context to this. Now, with that said, I want to bring us back to the issue of business. I find trade and business and entrepreneurship and commerce to be a safe space. And what do I mean by a safe space? We all, when you talk about a business and entrepreneurship, we all want to make money. Every company wants to have a good balance sheet. So there is a lingo that we all understand, whether we are mainstream white, Caucasian American, or African American, or Hispanic Latino American, or Asian American. We have certain things that make us part of a community. And you can define community as a set of values. So if you're an African American business owner, at the end of the day, you want to be able to truly be a business. What does that mean? You're adding value to your consumer, and you're adding value to your employees. And at the end of the day, you're making a profit that adds value to your household. So we can all understand that sphere and be comfortable in that space. So I'm going to try to stay in that space, because that's one space that we can all speak in one lingo and be comfortable. That, I think, is where Minnesota's business leaders can tremendously contribute. It's a safe space in which you're a little bit less uncomfortable, and you can take certain risks with opening opportunities and opening doors for those communities. Each one of those communities have qualified businesses and qualified persons that you can handhold, that you can find an opportunity for. If you're running a $2 billion business, and I'm going to give you an example without naming companies, there are companies in Minnesota that are 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion of business. Now, if you're running a $5 billion company, forget even the United Health of the universe, let's even look at the the mid-level companies. If you're running a $5 billion company in Minnesota, and you're a CEO, and you have a board of directors, and your board of directors is 100% Caucasian American, and your C-level leadership is 80 to 90% men, and 80 to 90% mainstream individuals, not one Hispanic, not one African immigrant, not one African American. And occasionally you see one Asian American professor out of the East Coast or the West Coast gets invited to that board. Where will be the empathy for the people who live here, who are African Americans, African immigrants, and Hispanics, if the corporate level leadership doesn't reflect them, the board doesn't reflect them, and the senior leadership doesn't reflect them? Even when you mean well, if you're in Wayzata or Orono or Minnetonka, or even downtown Minneapolis headquartered company, and you really want to go find businesses to do business with, how will you find them if your leadership and your board and your friend level management does not reflect any of these communities? So I want to push us, all of us, to say, we have to go out there and diversify our boards, diversify our senior leadership, and diversify our vendor base. And not just look at the traditional places. Don't look at that janitorial company. Look at your IT, look at your staffing, look at your travel, look at how much you spend. If you're a $4 billion company and you spend 10% of your resources, which is almost 500 million, where is that money going? How much of it goes to ethnic minority businesses? And that's what I want to focus on, because I think we need to build equity. And by building equity, we've opened doors and opportunity, and thereby deal with some of these long-standing challenges that people sometimes would say, aha, I am empathetic. I've given $250 to this business. I have gone on Lake Street. I cleaned up Lake Street. Great. I'm glad you took brooms and cleaned Lake Street. But what next? How are you using your position as an individual in corporate America to make a difference?
So I think, and I know we're for time here, but I agree. I think, checking, we know that this is, something that, most of us, we just inherited, right? But it is part of our job to do what we can to put, the next generation and other future generations on track as much as possible. But for me, it comes down to values. What are your values, right? What matters to you? And I would think that, white wealth matters too. So I think it is about also addressing that, it's not that you're giving anything away, to anyone. We're sharing in a space that, we all have to live in. And we have to share our economics. We have to share the opportunities. We have to share the relationships and the resources. These are all normal, natural things that we need as human beings. And other people need them too, who are not Caucasian. So I think just where your values are, really determines how your business operates. And then you've got to take an extra step, right? To look beyond that and embrace what has been the historical issues here and figure out what your contribution is. So yes, looking at procurement, your diversity, supply chain, who are you doing business with? And are we moving from a place of doing transactions to investments? Those are two different things. And when you're dealing with, some of our businesses, not all of us are poor. Not all of us come with a bunch of restrictions, right? We work hard to build a middle class sector of our communities. So that, our children don't have to struggle through the same thing. So there are folks who are very capable, knowledgeable, and skilled, to engage these opportunities, but are they given that opportunity because of the perceptions we have about what those challenges are? So I think if we deal with our humanity, we can get to a place of doing real business, deal with people's education. Or for instance, when I was in school for education, we were taught to teach to the conditions of the children and not their potential. Major error, right? And so I think let's deal with the potential of people and make the right investments. And you'll know that based on the assessments that you make, right? For this a case-by-case situation. Every person of color that you connect with won't be that person who could deliver on the things you need. We're not suggesting that, but we certainly have to take a step, to making that long-term commitment to helping people be successful. Because, as a micro business owner to being a mainstream entrepreneur to a high level, those are 3 different categories of business, and they need 3 different layers of support. So for me, you've got to do that assessment and figure out what you can do. And know that, all the, diversity inclusion departments who are giving grants out to the community. So that's great. So it's everything you're doing plus what we don't know, right? So it's not a substitute. We don't substitute that we're giving out grants to this youth program, et cetera, through our corporation for not hiring, or promoting Black women in the workplace, right? We know that, Black women particularly are skilled and knowledgeable and qualified for positions that they don't get promoted. They'll promote someone and that position has been with the company for 2 years versus the person's been there for 10 years. So while I'm big on entrepreneurship, workforce matters too. It's about having income streams. That's what's important. That's how you build assets. That's part of how you build wealth. You got to have the money. And so when a person of color or Black person, whatever, is discriminated against because of the perceptions we have, knowing or not, and because of their color, etc., what you're doing is interrupting somebody's ability to build stability in their lives, economic prosperity and stability through their generations. And we've got to have that lens that, oh, this might be a mother. Oh, this is a father who's providing, right? This is not just my personality or the personal issues. We're dealing with someone's life ability to, provide for themselves. And that's what you're disrupting, or not you, but I'm just in general, this is what's being disrupted by these choices we make. And we've got to be accountable for that. And Alfredo said, we're not putting people in the corners of just diversity. Every Black person you hire is your diversity leader now. No, that's inappropriate. And for that to be the only role we're playing. And so for me, we just got to do that assessment of our institutions and also make a commitment from our values about, the future of our companies. We know that, the future generations of this country will be, youth of color. How are we setting them up? Because, is it about setting up a good economy for the United States, for Minnesota? We're a very wealthy state. So we have a lot of privilege too, right? So there's a lot of Fortune 500 countries or companies here, and we can kind of kick back. We're just really laid back here. But that's okay for Minnesota. But there's a lot of us struggling who don't have the privilege to lay back. And the rest of the world, we're not building communities of people who are prepared to compete on a global scale, right? Because we're so stuck in this privilege. We're so stuck in this. We want to have conversations. We want to set up committees and all these studies. And no, we need to get to action. Put your money, your relationships, the job positions, the business contracts, the consultants, from the people you buy tissue from the people you buy paper from, all of that matters. Checks and balances, racial equity scorecard, figure out who you're giving it to. And when you say minority, I'll wrap it up. When you're talking about women, we also have to break that up because white women are winning in that and we're not. So we've got to make sure that even in the space of women, that Black and other women of color and indigenous women are getting these opportunities too. So we can't cover all of that in this conversation, but I'm happy to follow up and let's figure this out.
I really appreciate that. In fact, if any who are paying attention now have some questions, we have a few minutes for some questions before we wrap up. Please drop them in the chat. I just will comment, building on everything that everyone said there. I mean, we know that having a more diverse, inclusive set of economies will bring trillions into the United States economy and billions into the Minnesota, probably $1 trillion into the Minnesota economy. And we see these staggering numbers. Where I'm really curious, and I know you all are too, is how do we get particularly these white boards or white leaders to begin to be willing to dig into that space and say, to unlock that trillion, we have to do this whole set of new investigations that to this point we've either chosen not to investigate, or maybe we've relegated it to this like social service or grant space, and not actually seen it as deeply, deeply about capital investment, and seeing the human capital and the financial capital being intrinsically tied. And when we get that going, then we begin to unlock things. But there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of, well, I didn't know that. And no one likes to most people don't like to wake up and say, oh, I'm an oppressor. And so I just know that there's a lot of interior work that leaders have to do, white leaders have to do, white male leaders have to do in particular, to begin to understand it and unlock it. But this is, especially in the marketplace conversation, about unlocking new marketplaces, about bringing uplift to all pieces of this. It's an everything gap and an everything challenge.
You know, Dan, the only thing I would jump in and say is that, you know, in that you made a great point that, you know, Minnesota is a strong philanthropic, you know, community, and, you know, we're comfortable in that space in the capitals. But here's the deal: when this recession hits, right, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You know, I mean, we have to answer the question as Minnesota leaders about what kind of, how are we going to respond, right? Not how the federal government, but how are we going to respond as business leaders, right? As economic leaders to help, right, our community. And we won't solve every problem. That's not the point. And we can't personalize these things or say, well, I'm not racist or I'm not. That's not the point. It's just about understanding it from a systemic, I mean, where you can do it personally, fine. But that's not what, at least I'm interested in you bringing to the table. Hold whatever opinions you have. Let's look at the broader thing here. And, you know, what kind of legacy do we want to leave for the state of Minnesota, for ourselves as business leaders? And how do we create more synergy across the cultural economy that is necessary for a good future?
That's great. We have just a couple minutes, maybe closing thoughts from each of you, in no particular order. Siad's talking, but I'm not hearing.
Oh,
there we go.
I had muted myself. So, okay. But anyway, I appreciate what everyone, my co-panelists, Alfredo and Kenya said. I know there's a lot there to unpack, but Dan and Steve and Mary Beth, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I say, you know, at the end of the day, we are in the relationships business. We're humans. We're part of the human race. And it's easy to always categorize and go into silos. Business people like silos. We like to reduce things to spreadsheets. So I say, you know, let's open our hearts. Let's open our minds. And let's think a little bit more as a Minnesota family. And think about some of the things that, you know, the panelists said. And you get out of this talk asking yourself, and you're right, Dan, nobody feels good about being chastised. I'm not a guru or you know, I haven't lived for 100 years, but one thing I know is that people don't do well when they're uncomfortable or accused, right? So I want us to be uncomfortable without being accusatory, and get out of the comfort zone, knowing that we're interested in solutions. We're not interested in shaming, because you're right. At the end of the day, you want to look yourself in the mirror and feel good about yourself. And these are institutional problems, generally not individually caused. But yes, institutions are made of individuals, and we individuals can make changes. Even incremental changes add up to an avalanche in the end. If we all go on a leap of faith and decide that we're going to be better as a community, that we're going to look at abject poverty in our state so that no kid goes home. When I read that school districts under COVID were contemplating not closing because kids only had a meal in school. Think about that. Think about that. That a school has to remain open because the only place kids could eat is to come to school. I don't think any of us want to live in such a society. So let's think about those things and think about how we can eliminate abject poverty in our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Siad. Either Kenya or Alfredo, final remarks.
Kenya.
We didn't, talk a lot about it, but, I think I've tried to sum up what I'm thinking as best as possible. It's a lot happening right now, but I would say that, this is about, for me as a Black woman entrepreneur and the work that I do, it is specifically about building a clear pathway to economic stability and prosperity. And for us, it means, yes, access to capital, access to social, networks, and, so the social capital is also important, but also credit. We didn't talk a lot about the financial institutions and the role that plays in, entrepreneurs being successful, having those banking relationships. I just say that, we probably need a part 2. There's a lot to talk about. But yeah, it's not about criticism. Take it. It is what it is. It comes, especially from folks like me in my community. You're not going to have me on a panel talking to me not talk about those things. I mean, it's just what it is, because that's the reality I'm in, of what we're living through. But we don't do it without the work, right? So we're working. So just stay committed and figure out what you can do from your space. Build relationships with people. There's a lot of information out here. Dan's great. The Downtown Council is bringing us in, and others, to begin to figure out like what you can do from your, none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. So you can figure out what that looks like for you, where you fall on the spectrum, and let's figure out how to work together.
Thank you so much. And I will comment, criticism is how we've all grown, and I know it's a value of businesses to be transformed by the criticisms that shape us. And so I invite that too. I invite that, of course. Alfredo, take us out. Then I've got just a couple quick comments before we sign off.
No, the only thing that I would add and is courage. I think that being in the uncomfortable conversation is important, but having the courage to be in that uncomfortable space is what's going to make this not a flavor of the month or a campaign of 2020. And remember back in 2020 when we all got our woke moment? No, we have to get in those uncomfortable places and then make decisions that are sustainable and systematic. None of this, I saw a great post on LinkedIn said, I will not do a 2-hour anti-racism seminar. I will not do a 2-hour because you will not do anything properly, long-term, sustainable, and systematically in 2 hours. So have the courage to do the work, have the courage to challenge biased systems that you might find yourself in. That does not make you a biased person, but it makes you a person that now is enlightened and understands where you're standing, whether it's a place of privilege or a place of bias or anything like that. That does not make it personal. It makes you now an informed observer and an agent of change. And what we need more than anything right now is people that are ready to run this marathon, not just do a quick sprint and call it a day. So I look for marathon runners. I appreciate you all. My panelists are awesome. And I wish we could have a glass of wine afterwards, but we can't.
Yes, I wish we could too. Here's to a post-COVID happy hour together. And yes, with all who are on this this webinar as well. Well, I'm going to wrap up here, everybody. Thank you for staying on just a couple minutes longer for those who've been a part of the webinar. Thank you to Syed Abdullahi, Kenya McKnight Ahad, Alfredo Martel, the organizations that you lead. We are grateful for them in our Minnesota and Minneapolis marketplace. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in or who's watching this virtually. This will be posted to the YouTube channel for the Minneapolis Downtown Council in just a little bit. You can follow us through the Minneapolis Downtown Council website, social media channels for other notifications for virtual panels like this. And to the comments, this is not a one and done, and it's not even a 1 year and done. And we are committed to the long arc of diversity, equity, and inclusion to make downtown a more inclusive downtown. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe and be well, and have a good rest of a Wednesday. Take care.